Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars and you're watching another episode From the Luthier's Workbench. This is episode 107, and in the last episode, which was 106, I finished by explaining how I use one of these fret rocker tools to get an idea of the state of my fret installation on a guitar neck. And the reason that I do this is because I use two different techniques for leveling my frets. And typically I'll use one technique or the other technique. And which one I use is based on the condition or how level all the frets are in relation to one another. And what I'll do is I'll take the fret rocker tool and I'll start checking the frets, and this is done 3 at a time, and I'm looking for frets which may have high spots. And if I encounter a high spot on one of the frets, I'll grab a red Sharpie and I'll mark where I came across a high spot. And then after I'm done, if I have typically more than 5 high spots on the frets, I will elect to use a technique which levels all of the frets at once, and that means using a fret leveling beam. If, on the other hand, I find that the frets are mostly level, and again, as I've explained before, if I've really lucked out in making the radius of my fretboard and radiusing each of the sections of fret wire and then pressed them in correctly, there's always a good chance that I may end up with no high spots or very, very few. But if I end up with fewer than 5, high spots on frets along the length of the fretboard, I'll use a different technique to level, and that is just to spot level using a 3-corner file. So in this case, I found that these frets had more than 5 high spots, and since I want to demonstrate both the techniques, I'm going to go ahead and use the fret leveling beam and show you on this particular neck how I level the frets. Now, before I jump in and explain this process, I should explain the table that I'm working on. And I talked about this before. This is just a plywood table that has a 2x4 extending out the end, and then it has some 3/8 inch diameter steel rods. There's 4 of them, which I can raise and lower and tighten into position with some thumb screws. And for those of you who are astute, you'll notice that this table looks a lot like the old StewMac string tension simulating jig that they offer. And you'd be right, it was based on that design. And the one change that I made was originally it had dial indicators on it so that I could accurately simulate string tension, but I found that simulating string tension is more useful for repairing guitars than it is for building new guitars. So I ended up just removing them because I simply didn't use them that much, and I had other tools that could make use of the dial indicator. So I took those off, and now I just use it to support the neck when I'm working on doing my fret leveling. And I can do a neck by itself, and which in this case the neck is bolted to a piece of maple, which is then bolted to the platform itself. Or I can put an entire guitar body on the plywood with the neck extending out over the support here. So but what I do typically is I'll get this all set up, and then I start to make some fine-tuning adjustments before I start to level. Before I can begin leveling, the first thing I need to do is to make sure that my neck is straight and level, and that there's no bow or twist or anything like that. And I've already determined that there's no twist, but I want to check to see if there's any kind of bow going on. And it's really common after you've pressed in or hammered in frets that bow can form because of the stresses of pressing the fret tang down into the slot. So I've got everything bolted. They got the neck bolted down to my table here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a notched straight edge. This is a precision straight edge. It's notched to go over the frets. And this will allow me to check to make sure that the fretboard itself is level. And I'm looking for any gaps that may form, which would indicate that there's some bow going on. And if I notice any gaps, what I can do is take a Allen wrench and adjust the truss rod to eliminate any gaps. And as soon as the neck is nice and straight, I'm good to go. Now, one thing I should mention is when I make my necks, the fretboard is, the radius is pretty level from the nut all the way to about the 14th fret. It's pretty straight. But then from the 14th fret to the end of the fretboard, I purposely add, while I'm fine-tuning the radius during the final sanding stages, I add a little bit of fall off, so it gradually drops off towards the end. And the reason for that is when this is the area where the strings oscillate the most as they're vibrating, and you can get some string buzz in this area. It's quite common, even though the strings are higher off the fretboard, because the strings are vibrating so much, you can have issues. So creating a little bit of fall off helps to alleviate that. So once I have the neck pretty straight and level, I'm ready to begin the leveling process. And that starts by highlighting the tops of the frets with a Sharpie. And this is just a way to kind of help gauge your progress as you're leveling the frets. And this is something you would want to do if you're leveling all the frets at once using a fret leveling beam. And that's what we're going to be doing with this neck. And remember, these are stainless steel frets, so when I use the beam, I'm going to be using about a 240 grit silicone carbide sandpaper. And that's what I have attached to this leveling beam. Now, this leveling beam itself is just it's a steel beam. There are aluminum ones out there, but I prefer steel because steel has weight and it makes it easier. That weight makes it easier to get the level. And then the surface that the sandpaper is attached to has been machined flat. So I attach it just a strip of 1 inch wide, like I said, 240 grit paper using some double-sided tape. And the technique for leveling at this point, oh, and I should mention, you'll notice I haven't masked off this fretboard, and that's because it's a rosewood fretboard, and it's not really going to cause a problem. It'll clean up nicely, and then I can add a little linseed oil when I'm done. And if it's a maple fretboard, it's a good idea to make sure that that maple fretboard has been clear coated with whatever clear coat product you're using, nitrocellulose, water-based acrylic, whatever, or water-based poly. Anyway, you want it to be sealed, and then it's still a good idea to mask off the fretboard because a light maple will really show the grime that's created from the sanding process. But with rosewood, I don't really worry that much about it. It doesn't seem to cause an issue. Now, as far as the actual process of leveling is concerned, with the leveling beam, I place the beam on the fretboard so that this edge is exactly parallel with the very center line of the fretboard. Now, in this case, I can't see a center line because it's been worn away, it's been sanded off, but I can get a pretty good idea just by looking at it that I'm parallel to that center line. And you want to stay parallel to the center line. You don't want to be parallel with the taper of the edge, because if you do that, you'll end up with an inaccurate radius on your fret wire, and you'll just have all kinds of problems trying to get a good level. So you keep the tool parallel to the center line of the neck. And then it's just a matter of running it. I typically just run in one direction and then make my way across the fretboard, staying parallel to that center line. Now at this point, I have most of the Sharpie removed up to about the 13th fret, and then as you can see, I'm not sure if you can actually see this on the video, but there's still Sharpie on all of these frets here at the end, and that's because of that fall off. And in a minute I will address that, but for now I'm mostly just concerned with getting the first 13 to 14 frets level with each other. And I can see at this point they are now level. I've removed the Sharpie from the tops, and it's left in some cases a very narrow flat spot. Now, to deal with getting these last frets from about the 14th fret to the end, to get those level with respect to the fall off, I'm just going to use the end of my beam. And again, I'm following the center line, staying parallel. Okay, I've got these frets, the last basically 10 frets from 14 on to 24 are now level with respect to the fall off. And then everything from about the 13th, 14th fret to the nut is level. But now what I have to do is recrown them, because now each fret has a very slight flat spot. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time I have for this episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. I hope to talk about my spot leveling technique as well as recrowning and polishing frets. But I'm trying to keep these episodes down to around 15 minutes each. So what I'll do is I'll just continue talking about those in future episodes. And in episode 108, I'll cover my spot leveling technique, and depending on how much time I have, I'll either continue with how I recrown and then polish the frets, or I'll just split those out into future episodes. And then once all these are done, I'll arrange them all into a fret leveling playlist so you can find them more easily and watch them at your leisure. So until the next episode, take care, and we will see you soon.